Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. Continuing our series on social protection in crisis and conflict. Today, we're exploring how the humanitarian agenda to localise international humanitarian assistance intersects with the challenges of maintaining the already inherently local social protection systems disrupted by conflict. My first guest from Yemen explains how international organisations have played a vital role in keeping Yemen's main cash transfer program operational for 1.5 million Yemenis over the course of the civil war, but with complex consequences for local authorities. And in Myanmar, my second guest argues that with national social protection programs curtailed, local forms of social protection are emerging from the grassroots, with implications for how we think about social protection, social contracts, and state legitimacy. Plus, we'll talk about the future of the localisation agenda at a time where global aid and humanitarian funding is substantially on the wane. Abeer Al-Absi is a consultant and researcher working with STAAR and Basic Research. She is in Yemen and specialises in social protection, humanitarian assistance, and localisation in conflict settings. Abeer, welcome to the Social Protection Podcast, and thanks for making the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited today to share my experience from Yemen, one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Thank you.
So the civil war in Yemen began in 2015. What toll has almost 10 years of war taken on the people in Yemen?
Well, 10 years of war have deeply affected Yemen. About 21.6 million people, roughly 2/3 of the population, needed help. And around 4 million people were displaced. Millions have lost their homes and jobs, making it hard to get enough food, water, and healthcare. The war has also disrupted education, leaving many children without a stable future.
And can I ask you, how has the conflict affected you in your own life?
Okay, the war deeply affected my family and me, just as it did to many other Yemeni families. I lived in a house near a military base in Sana'a, and when the war began, airstrikes heavily bombarded the neighborhood, as well as other areas across Yemen. I remember the sleepless nights, and my 4-year-old daughter at that time suffered trauma from the constant bombings. Fearing for our safety, we fled Sana'a first to my village in Taiz, and then to Amman, where we stayed there for about a year. In 2017, I returned back to Sana'a and began searching for a new job after the organization I had been working for shut down. And it was an uncertain and challenging time, especially since my husband, who is working as a civil servant, had lost his salary because most of the salaries in Yemen, especially in the northern area due to the government financial crisis, has stopped. We struggled, but I was fortunate to secure a position as a consultant, which allowed me to both support my family and also serve the people in need. Yemeni women are really strong despite all the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you, and I appreciate you sharing that experience. It just emphasises how totally disruptive conflict like this is for absolutely everybody in all walks of life. So coming to some of the work that you've been doing as a consultant and a researcher, Yemen's cash transfer, which is a large social assistance program, was already well established prior to the conflict. Can you start by telling me a bit about how it has continued to operate through this period, or how it's kind of stopped and started, and what its fate has been over this time?
Well, the Yemen's Unconditional Transfer Program, the UCT, is essentially the evolution of the pre-conflict Social Welfare Funds cash transfer program. This project, it was originally designed in 1996 to support poor and vulnerable households. The program was a well-established social assistance initiative. But however, as the conflict escalated in 2015, the traditional cash transfer mechanism was suspended due to the security and operational challenges. But recognizing both the urgent need to support families in crises and the importance of preserving the future capacity of Yemen's social protection system, the World Bank re-engaged in Yemen. In 2017, under the Yemen Emergency Crisis Response Project, that was the first name of the project, the UCT program was launched with UNICEF as its implementing partner.
So, as you were saying, international organisations, in this case the World Bank and UNICEF, have come to play a much larger role than previously. This cash transfer was originally administered by the local government institution, the Social Welfare Fund, or SWF. When it was restarted, administration was shifted to the Social Fund for Development, or the SFD, which is a different body. What has that meant for the local administrators and actors in Yemen?
SWF SFD, before the war, along with other also programs like the public workshop program, they were the umbrella of the social protection system in Yemen. The difference between SWF and SFD is that SWF is a parastatal organization whereby the staff are not a civil servant and they have to report not to the Ministry of Social Affairs, but to the Prime Minister. While SWF is a governmental organization. And after the war broke out in 2015, the country has been divided, South and North. SFD maintain their neutrality and maintain being one entity, not being divided. So the headquarters is still in Sana'a with the branches in other governorates, and they do have a branch in the southern area, like in Aden and Hadramaut and other areas. While SWF, they separated, and now you have like two headquarters, one in Aden and one in Sana'a. And SWF is under the Ministry of Social Affairs. So SWF is a governmental organization, and it was really hard to donor to continue working with the governmental organization. I think that was kind of saving of the social protection institutions to some extent. International actors have stepped in to make sure that to keep the core elements of the pre-conflict system while also introducing new systems and practices. On the one hand, capacities have been sustained and even built up. For example, the UCT program maintained key parameters from the pre-war SWF cash transfer program, such as the beneficiary list and the transfer value, to preserve the future seeds for a national social protection system. In addition, investments were made in kind of updating the operational system, like the call center, which was established with over 80 agents processing tens of thousands of calls, and payment delivery mechanisms were upgraded from the traditional post office channel to a banking system. But on the other hand, these interventions has come to a cost for the SWF, which is a governmental institution. Before the conflict, the SWF was a large, well-established institution with around 1,511 civil servants, with about 27% out of them being women, delivering critical social work and case management services, having this kind of in-depth knowledge of how to deal with the community, especially with the most vulnerable, like women, people with disabilities. Most of them having this kind of background on social work. They have been there for a long time. Like some of them, I met some senior staff with around 25 years of experience with the social work and having this kind of massive relationship with the local council, with the local leaders like sheikh and tribal leaders, because Yemen is a very tribal kind of sitting state. However, as donor conditions forced a shift toward short-term, individual, contractual engagement, many experienced SWF civil servants were sidelined and reduced to ad hoc roles, primarily like working as a community facilitators within the UCT programs. They have been contracted individually to play this kind of role in facilitation, given this kind of experience and relationship with the community and the leaders.
I was really interested in the paper that you wrote, and you've talked about it just now, this dynamic where you have a lot of investment in the kind of professional staff that were working for the Social Fund for Development. And I think often quite young, bright university students who are kind of coming in and building these really impressive call centres and payment systems and MIS that you've mentioned. But equally, you've got the soft skills of those SWF workers who, through no fault of their own, weren't able to do their jobs and have had to be brought back into the program as contractors.
Yeah. When I met the staff of UST, the Unconditional Cash Program with SFT, as you mentioned, they were really very talented youth, having this kind of great skills in English, computer, science. Most of them coming from different academic background, like medicines, internal design. And when you start to talk with them about their passion, it was kind of transition jobs for them until they can get a career that really adhere to their background. But for them, they feel also job and security because it's funded by donors and it could be anytime cut down. But having said that, those kind of very talented youth experienced in different aspects in reporting, Excel, in English, they really doing this kind of job perfectly in how to report to the donor, how to do this kind of adhering to the recommendations. On the other side, because it's social protection work, it's about people. It's not only about systems. People also need to be at the core of any programs. And for its social protection, it's really important to have this kind of caring of that people are in the core of the program. Having said that, having an experienced social workers is really important because by the end of the day, you are dealing with people on the ground and they are really poor. They are marginalized. Some of them people with disabilities, some of them really marginalized women. And you need this kind of skills, how to deal with those, how to talk with them, how to keep their kind of feeling that they still have this kind of dignity. And you need those people, the social workers, who really know how to deal with this type of work.
Of course, humanitarian assistance has played a large role through the civil war in Yemen, with WFP and others providing ongoing support. And when we're talking about in this humanitarian realm, there's a lot of discussion about localization or localizing humanitarian assistance from international organizations and NGOs to more local organizations. Why is working with and empowering local organisations or local actors, like the civil servants we've just been talking about, why is it so essential, particularly in a conflict situation?
Well, working with and empowering local organization is critical for several reasons. First, local actors possess in-depth contextual knowledge about the context, the culture, so on and so forth, and establish network that enable them to better understand and address the specific needs of their community. This local expertise is essential in complex conflict and a setting like Yemen, where the rapidly shifting security and political landscapes make it really challenging for external agencies to operate effectively, as well as understand the culture and norms that need to be taken so carefully to avoid do harm, especially for women.
So what does the humanitarian localization agenda look like from the perspective of local organizations in Yemen?
Local NGO or local civil society, they will reply to you saying that they are dealing with us as a contractors. And that is a very big mistake. International organization, unfortunately, dealing with the national organization or CBOs as a contractor or services providers because they do have access and they know how to negotiate with the local actors, especially in the north, whereby it's really challenging environment, whereby a lot of constraints are there. And unfortunately, international organizations, they are transfer the risks to the local organization, but they don't really work with them or deal with them. as an equal partner. Give them the space to participate in designing of the project, given the fact that they are the one who have this kind of relationship with the community. So there is a gap on that. Localization, it's not only that how much money you transfer to the local organization. It's beyond that. It's about ownership. You feel that you are a Yemeni and you have this kind of say or voice on how the project needs to be implemented or need to be designed in your country, because you are the one who knows the dynamics, who knows what is going on, who knows the culture. And that, unfortunately, have this kind of gap to understand how to best deliver the projects. And that also led to have a weak kind of civil society. When you talk about civil society, that means strong organization that they can really represent their community. They can do this kind of advocacy. They can play a role in stability and peace. Localization is beyond only transfer. It's beyond that. We need to really revisit our understanding and humanitarian response. Because humanitarian response, especially in protracted crises, yes, humanitarian response would be very nice, very good in this kind of like a short-term war or a short-term kind of crisis. But in Yemen, like 10 years, it's a protracted crisis. And you cannot working like that for like 10 years, only deliver, and you didn't build a good kind of civil society that they can also advocate for the rights of the people, and they can be attached to the people, and they can then help in this kind of social protection scheme. Working with the humanitarian development peace nexus, how you provide this kind of assistance that will build the social cohesion, not to divide the community.
And again, so essential in that conflict kind of environment. Again, talking about capacities and trying to pivot back to local organisations, but also local institutions. I think in the case study that you worked on, there was some discussion about the plans for the unconditional cash transfer going forward and how to kind of bring the social welfare fund back into more of a central role, or at least to be working with those facilitators, those social workers more in the future. Do you think are steps being taken to try and kind of shift this back to where it was, recognising the strengths of the institutions that existed previously?
UNICEF and the World Bank having this kind of agreement with the Social Fund for Development to build the capacities of the SWF, so that after a while they will again bring back the project to SWF after building the capacity again and after doing all this kind of work. And now, as I told you, they do this kind of individual contracting with the sum of SWF staff, and that also build their capacity to some extent, give them like kind of hope that they can have work again. I always recommend other international organizations, please, whenever you have this kind of social protection work on the ground, make sure that you seek the help of those social workers on the ground. They have the experience and they have the knowledge and they have the passion overall.
Abeer Al-Absi, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you.
Al-Naim is a Yangon-based researcher who has studied social protection for nearly 2 decades, with a strong focus on community-based systems. His recent work has looked at how communities have responded to the crisis in Myanmar, setting up their own systems for humanitarian aid and social protection. Welcome to the Social Protection Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
In this series, we're talking about conflict and protracted crisis in a number of settings. Can you briefly describe the ongoing crisis in Myanmar and what it means for its people in 2025?
I think Myanmar, over the last sort of couple of decades, was characterized by a process of perhaps emerging from a sort of protracted period of being isolated in the world with some political and economic reforms. Like everywhere else as well, COVID pandemic represented a major setback to that, but that was deeply complicated by a coup d'etat in February 2021, which not only pushed back on many of the measures which would have enabled recovery from the COVID pandemic, but also really plunged the country into a much deeper crisis where resistance to military junta rule solidified amongst the general public and has then begun to push back against military rule in many different areas. That's then been accompanied not just by a civil conflict, but by a deepening economic crisis and displacement. 3, perhaps even 4 million people are displaced through conflict at the current time.
So you were describing a kind of an emerging state prior to the coup d'etat and COVID. What kinds of social assistance or sort of welfare systems were present in 2021 and before the coup?
Prior to that time, you kind of had 2 streams of social protection. Now, obviously, fairly similar to many other contexts. Myanmar's always had a very long tradition of self-organized welfare at community level, and that goes back decades. And particularly in parts of central Myanmar, most villages would have some form of self-organized welfare system to kind of cope with sort of issues like funerals and sometimes health crises for village members. But alongside that, particularly after 2008 and the cyclone Nargis, which was a sort of huge natural disaster, more formalized social protection systems began to be able to be developed. And kind of alongside a lot of the political and economic reforms, particularly in the sort of mid sort of 2015, 16 and beyond, a much more, if you like, systematic approach to social protection was beginning to take shape. Things like maternal and child cash transfers, and also cash transfers for older persons, and a much broader social protection framework, which was established at a national level. And that was all beginning to take shape, and actually during the COVID pandemic was leveraged to provide a significant amount of assistance to people who were negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic. So that was kind of pre-coup. And obviously, since then, much of that has simply ceased to function and been dismantled, certainly in terms of the more formal sector social protection systems.
Are you able to also comment on the international humanitarian presence in the country now and the extent to which humanitarian aid is or isn't or hasn't been able to step in where the social protection systems have kind of diminished?
I think the international humanitarian presence in Myanmar has always been a fairly restricted space, certainly apart from perhaps even the last sort of the 2 or 3 years prior to the coup. Most of that time, international humanitarian presence has been hugely difficult, and a mixture of UN agencies and NGOs, but with fairly tight restrictions in terms of what can be done. Much local humanitarian activity is also heavily controlled. Many small CSOs being shut down or raided, and certainly lots of surveillance on financial transactions, which then kind of restrict the ability of organizations to deliver aid. And I think the situation that many international agencies find themselves in is needing to deal with de facto authorities in the form of the current military junta, but recognizing that is deeply unpopular with much of the population that they are purporting to serve. Adding to that, really, difficulties of access. So many parts of the country where the military would control possibly 20 to 30% of the territory in relatively uncontested terms. Many of the people that would need assistance are actually in areas that are under the control of other groups.
Can you explain what that looks like a little bit?
What you do have, looking at a map of the territory that's marked out as what previously constituted Myanmar, is different areas that are under control of different armed groups. And some of those armed groups, long established groups in perhaps more of the border areas, where there is an agenda for ethnic affiliated autonomy. And then lots of the other areas, newly formed militia that formed since the coup, and again, often controlling fairly small areas of territory.
So to that point you touched on just then about providing services, tell me a bit more about what kinds of local social assistance, welfare has emerged to fill some of those gaps left by those central state programs, and I guess given the limited international humanitarian presence in Myanmar.
Yeah, and I think this is, for me, kind of quite a significant part of the discussion we're having today. as a researcher, the sort of question comes about the role of social protection in building the state from below. I think social protection has long sort of been something viewed as part of a state building exercise, but often approaching it from a strong central state and building a legitimacy which then spreads down towards the grassroots. The question we have is, well, what happens if that central state either doesn't exist or is perhaps even hostile to many of its grassroots? And asking a different question, which is, can social protection have a role in shaping the state from the bottom up? So it's like turning the whole thing upside down. And what we're seeing in some of the areas that we've studied is communities, and it's often at a very granular level, organizing themselves to begin to deliver some fairly basic welfare services. So aside from healthcare, organizing, for example, for disaster management and relief, so ways that a community can respond to displacement or flooding, but also looking at perhaps more established systems of asking, how do we support people with disabilities in our community? How do we support older persons in our community who are vulnerable? And the key, in many ways, is the development of systems, visible systems which don't just deliver something once, but are able to deliver something consistently in a transparent way, and a way which shows a degree of public accountability. So the armed elements of governance are fairly visible and tangible. What's needed is the counterbalancing civilian elements, which are offering different forms of protection more around the sort of social and economic spheres. And so, often at a very granular level, but sometimes also at a sort of a level where different communities cooperate on a slightly more scaled project. And I think the sort of, if you like, the sort of longer term perspective of that, trajectory of that is, well, perhaps these are some of the building blocks which then begin to go into assembling something of a larger scale.
Can I dig in a little bit to what those sort of organised systems are starting to look like? What do the system elements look like in these organising units that you're describing?
I mean, at the most basic, even before you sort of get to technological elements, is the sort of system around, well, how do we work out what we're going to do and who we're going to support through our programs? How do we generate funding for this? And I think in particular, the interesting element is the way that local communities often work in the nexus, what we would call the nexus, and what basically everyone else experiences as normal life, is that the connection between, say, setting up a community revolving fund, which generates interest payments, which are then leveraged to make welfare payments. That's a sort of fairly common mechanism of thinking in many of the communities we work in, looking for things which are sustainable, but which are also not simply a kind of standalone welfare program, but actually linked to wider economic issues and needs, such as the lack of access to microfinance at the moment. And so for communities, it's sort of, okay, the system is about looking at how we have transparent prioritization, looking at how we generate funding, also looking at how we are managing this in a transparent way, primarily to our own community. Technology comes in a little bit in terms of, perhaps as a group of researchers, we have often provided extra support and opportunity for some of these groups to be collecting data on some of their outcomes. And that's been an important part of them being able to go back to communities and say, actually, this is, we're doing things in a way which is genuinely delivering some tangible outcomes.
In Myanmar, with the different armed groups, are these kind of co-opting that work, or are they adding and building on it?
I think I should add the caveat here that it is different in different areas. And perhaps probably the sort of most fertile example is in the sort of northwestern part of the country, where you have multiple very localized armed groups who, some are part of a broader network, some are not. And many are sort of very much focused on their own community and have legitimacy within their own community. And so within those communities, you then also have, if you like, civilian actors, so those that are not part of the armed group, who organize to focus more on civilian aspects of governance, including the provision of the social protection. Now, the cooperation and overlap between those varies from place to place. And you have civilian governance infrastructure there, which sometimes is separate to some degree to the social protection providing groups. So lots of negotiation going on there. In and of itself, actually, that's a healthy process most of the time in terms of saying, okay, actually, who should be responsible for what here? How does this fit together to actually benefit the people that are living in this community? There are structures at a higher level, and certainly in some of the areas more under the control of what we would call ethnic armed organizations. Some of those have much more well-defined departments that would, say, be looking at things like health and education, varying degrees of development.
Is there a financing element to that as well?
The answer is, again, complex and mixed and depends on where you are. I think what's remarkable is the degree of funding which is sourced either locally or, let's say, from a broader network of diaspora. It is continued to surprise and inspire in the same moment, the extent to which many of these processes can raise funds. At the same time, this is sort of one of the areas where international humanitarian support, I think, can be quite helpful, provided it's willing to recognize the need, the sort of quite sort of deeply political nature of social protection in a context like this, not simply being a technocratic exercise, not simply being an exercise in, oh, let's get a local partner to distribute the aid that we think is good for people, but rather as a process of saying, we can see that providing a degree of financial and technical support to groups there could actually help the emergence of credible, sustainable systems, which can then influence the emergence of accountable, transparent forms of governance. I think that requires embracing an element of the political nature of social protection. Being honest about it, I think, is probably a better way of saying it. But to me, I think that's sort of one of the areas where, yes, there is quite a lot of locally sourced funding. But at the same time, I think there's a very useful and strategic role for international donors and humanitarian actors to engage with this as well.
So, as you've already started to describe, social protection is often conceptualized as being part of, that Rousseauian social contract between citizen and state. So what does it mean for these more local or these subnational or these kind of quasi-independent authorities to be providing this kind of assistance now?
I think that, again, sort of comes back to some of the sort of earlier musings, if you like, about, well, where does the social contract lie in the absence of the state? And I think an argument that a number of us have been making for many years now is that the basic sort of elements, the resources, if you like, for building a bigger social contract between citizens and, let's say, a more established state structure, the basic elements for that are actually already present at grassroots level, but they're at a scale whereby the social contract is much more visible between members of a community and, if you like, their own community, rather than with a higher level political community. And the argument, and it's an argument I've perhaps sort of had for the last decade with social protection planners, is to build social protection system from the top down, which only really focuses on a social contract between an individual citizen and the central state directly, is to miss an enormous opportunity to mobilize this huge reservoir of social trust, which community members often have in organizations in their own community. And this is what we're now seeing, that the central state essentially out of the equation. What people are doing is building whatever state they can in the place that they are and beginning to build it in a way that they think they want it to look like. I think we can sort of see social protection as perhaps playing a very key role in the post-state scenario, which I suspect will be a reality in more situations rather than less in the decades to come. Not just in terms of states collapsing, but even parts of countries and states where this sort of central state simply cannot be present anymore.
Al-Nain, thank you so much for making time to join us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Courtney Cabot-Venton. Courtney is an international development economist and the founder and executive director of the SHARE Trust. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
In this episode, we've been talking about the role of local actors in delivering social protection and humanitarian assistance, particularly in situations of conflict and protracted crisis. Courtney, your organisation, the SHARE Trust, published Passing the Buck, a paper, The Economics of Localising International Assistance in 2022, and it was a bit of a landmark study at that time. What were the headline findings back then, and how have you been following up on that analysis since?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm trained as an economist, so I love any opportunity I have to use data to try to understand an issue in development and aid more deeply. And happened a few summers ago to stumble across a large amount of data on cost structures at the UN and INGOs that allowed us to construct an analysis looking at the economics of localizing aid. And by using that data and applying it to all of official development assistance in 2018, we were able to estimate that channeling 25% of funding to local actors, specifically local intermediary actors, would yield a 32% cost efficiency as compared to channeling assistance via international actors. We chose the 25% because that aligned with the grand bargain, but also at the time USAID's commitments on localization, and really wanted to get a better understanding of what the economic argument, as a complement to the very robust and clear moral argument, what that might look like in terms of helping us to understand how we can drive better efficiency in this system. At the time, the study became very high profile. It ended up in The Economist and was used in 3 congressional testimonies, which was amazing. And really importantly, also meant that we had a number of countries come to us to say, could you please replicate this analysis for us by using actual country-based budgets? So how we followed up on that analysis since the release of that initial study is that over the last year, we were able to ground truth the study in 4 countries, 2 in the Middle East that remains anonymous just for reasons of sensitivity around our local actors. And then we also were really lucky that UN-OCHA shared their budgetary data with us for all of their funding delivered through the pooled funds in Ukraine and Nigeria, which allowed us to actually compare a UN, an INGO, and a local actor cost structure to see if those findings bore out. And the average cost efficiency across each of those countries ranged between 14 and 19%, whilst that was less than the 32% in the global study. The data was actually very similar, and the main explanation for why it was less was simply because the pooled funds don't have so many levels of pass-through of budgets going to lots of different actors within a single program. So the overall sentiment was that it was very likely that if we looked at some of the more centralized budgets, that we'd see really similar cost efficiencies to the 32%. And obviously has been a really important piece of work to understand and help to drive the evidence base around channeling more funding to local actors.
I was interested in your model, which envisages establishing a transition fund to really build systems and capacities for local organisations and make that investment so that they can or could effectively implement that 25% of international assistance that was the subject of those targets. So I'm just interested in why you saw that as being so important and what would that kind of transition fund or that transition look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess a few points to tease out on that. The first is that the study specifically looked at local intermediaries rather than individual local actors. And that's really important because not only is it expensive, but most of our funding systems are not geared up to give grants to 50 or 100 individual organizations. Most donor business cases will have 2 or 3 major investments. And so having some kind of an intermediary structure that is based locally is really critical for that to work. but that really that ecosystem needs to be built because there are many individual local actors, particularly at a grassroots level, but who are already doing a lot of the delivery as well in any case, but that there needs to be some kind of a funnel to be able to channel that funding to them. So that's one piece. The second piece was that when we evaluated the UN, INGO, and local actor budgets, we found that the INGOs and the LNGOs were all redistributing overheads to their downstream partners, which are 7% under UN OCHA pooled fund rules. So they would charge 7% on the whole budget, but then they would say, okay, if you have 5 million in your subcontracted budget, you get 7% overhead on that. And as we know, that funding is absolutely critical for local actors to be able to build their capacity. The UN systematically was not passing through overheads to any of their downstream partners. And I think that this is a really critical point, that another part of this sort of transition is that we really need to ensure that international intermediaries are distributing their overheads down to their downstream partners.
Very recently, we've seen the US freeze or cancel its humanitarian and development funding. The UK also recently announced it will significantly reduce its aid spend by 2027. Similar cuts have been announced by France, Germany, and other European donors. We're looking ahead to a future where there is simply just a lot less money in the system. What do you think this will mean for the localisation agenda? And I guess particularly you've been talking a lot about efficiency and savings. Is this going to drive this conversation further, do you think?
It's a great question. And obviously, it's been very difficult to watch everything that has happened, especially knowing the implications that it will have for downstream partners, particularly in the short term. But I do think that it also offers a very significant opening and opportunity to really strengthen the way that we think about how we deliver assistance and to see, I think it could be one of the biggest opportunities that we have seen to fundamentally shift the way that we do this work towards local actors leading on design and implementation. And I was at a meeting a few weeks ago in London, and one of my colleagues said that this could mean that we just do less with less, and that would be a real shame. Or do we as a community have the vision and the push to actually step in and roll our sleeves up and do things differently? But it is going to require that we step into a space of really reshaping how we deliver both social protection and humanitarian assistance, really putting local leaders at the forefront of that and finding new mechanisms and ways that we can get what money is still in the system to local actors. I do think that in my conversations with bilateral donors in particular, the number and amount of cuts has really sharpened everybody's focus to the absolute imperative to make every single dollar that goes through this system work as well as it can for all of the people who will ultimately suffer from the funding cuts. So I think there's an appetite, and I just hope that we can all be brave and step into that space and see how we can transform the system to be a phoenix rising out of what feels right now like a whole lot of ashes.
Courtney Cabot-Venton, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Jo. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this second episode in our 3-part series on social protection in conflict and protracted crisis. It was produced by socialprotection.org, organised by STAAR Facility and Basic Research, in partnership with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, which has funded this series and provided invaluable support in shaping the episodes and connecting us with guests. We'll be back next month with the final episode in our series, looking at social protection and the peace, development and humanitarian nexus. See you then.